You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. This is the story of two very different, very special dresses, each made in 1945 for two very different young women on opposite sides of the world. Henryka Schermont was a Jewish survivor of the Nazi death camps. Maud Tyrrell was an Australian farm girl who fell in love with an American soldier.
Yeah, it's a relatively new gallery.
We're starting with Henryka's dress, which is on display in a glass cabinet in the Memorial's Holocaust Gallery. It's a typical 1940s style white and navy gingham frock with a fitted waist and short puffy sleeves.
She is an incredible survivor of the Holocaust, but in order to understand the dress, you really have to go back and start at the beginning.
Eleni Holloway is an assistant curator who's researched Henryka's harrowing story.
Henryka and her family lived in Krakow, Poland. She was born there in 1925. And when the Second World War broke out and Poland was invaded, her and her family attempted to flee Krakow. On foot, she was carrying a tiny little suitcase filled with chocolates from her uncle's sweet shop. And it wasn't long before their attempt to flee was stopped because Henryka contracted cholera and her family were forced to return to Krakow. They were all interned in the Krakow ghetto in March 1941 with other Jewish families. At that time, she was only 15 years old. But that was really the start of many years of internment, beginning with the Krakow ghetto and then followed by 5 concentration camps.
The first of those terrible camps was Plazow, on the outskirts of Krakow.
And at Plazow, Henryka encountered the notoriously sadistic SS camp officer, Camp Commandant Amon Get, known as the Butcher of Plazow. She lived in constant fear of him, as did many others, and she soon came to learn that when he wore a white scarf, as people often did to the opera, that he was going to start shooting and beating prisoners.
At random?
Yes, at random. So they would keep their heads down, not make eye contact with him, and just avoid being noticed by him. But that didn't stop her from receiving a beating. She one day was being flogged in front of Armanget, in front of 100 people with some other prisoners. And the beating was interrupted by a man who managed to get Armanget's attention away. The man was Oskar Schindler. So that day he saved Henryka's life as well as the lives of 100 people.
It was a narrow escape, but life was about to get even tougher. When her mother was taken away, Henryka and her father presumed she'd been sent to Auschwitz. Her father fell into a deep depression, was hospitalised and given a lethal injection by the very doctor Henryka had begged to save him.
So now Henryka was on her own, no mother, no father. She didn't know where her sister was. Her brother was not there.
So they were sent to different camps?
Yes, and she really talks about how at that point she started to become quite reckless because she had nothing to lose. She had lost her parents. Alone and afraid, she was loaded onto another cattle truck and then she was transported to the death camp Auschwitz. And at Auschwitz, on arrival, she was forced to strip and line up in front of the SS guards. She was quite tall, thin, not much bust. She was 16 at the time, but her mother said to her she had to tell everyone that she was 18 so that she wouldn't be taken off with the children. So when a guard approached her and asked her how old she was, she said, "I'm 18." And at that moment, a tiny little photo montage of her family that she had stuck underneath her tongue flew out. And at this point, she's naked. And the guard was absolutely furious with her. He beat her and kicked her, telling her to go to a different line. And she noticed that the line that she was moved into was full of elderly, frail and sick people. She knew what that meant. And she really just took her chance. She thought, I've got nothing to lose. She crawled out of the line, went to the back of the line hoping that she wouldn't be recognised. And at that point, her gamble really did pay off because they didn't recognise her and she was able to move into the other line. At Auschwitz, she was branded with the number a 26538 on her left arm, on the inside of her left arm. And within days she met up with a family friend, a woman called Henryka Siegel, who really took her under her wing and shared food with her because she really thought that she needed it more than her.
As the Russians approached in 1945, Henryka and Henryka were herded onto cattle trucks and taken to Bergen-Belsen. Within weeks they were moved again to Venusberg camp and forced to work in an aeroplane factory.
She became really gravely ill with typhus at Venusberg while nursing the sick. There she suffered hallucinations. She saw visions of her mother, which gave her strength, but her friends really did keep her alive. They brought her food. As things became worse for the Germans, with the Allies approaching, they were forced to march to Mauthausen concentration camp. The weakest were shot along the way, and Henryka knew that it was really important to stay to the front of the line in order to survive the march. When they arrived at Mauthausen, the prisoners were taken to the gas chambers, and they were standing in front of the gas chambers with the doors wide open, where they were told by one of the guards that they had run out of Zyklon B, which was the killing agent used in the gas chambers, but that they were going to get some more. In the meantime, here's some food, here's some chocolates, here's some tin sardines. Just a terrible thing to go through. She continued to face death at so many points, and here she is right at the end. She's incredibly ill. She's just survived a death march, and at Mauthausen, she is incredibly weak. She was very, very close to death. She could no longer talk. When Henryka saw white figures walking towards her, she thought she had died and gone to heaven. It actually turned out to be American soldiers in white suits spraying clouds of the insecticide DDT, and they were in protective suits. That was May 1945, and that was the day that she was liberated. She was naked, wrapped in a bedsheet, incredibly ill, and she had nothing to wear.
Henryka's fellow campmates raided the SS barracks for whatever fabric they could find, including bed sheets and curtains. And this is how her treasured dress was made.
We believe that Henryka's dress was made from SS curtains. They made her this beautiful dress so that she would have something to walk out of the camps in.
When an item like this comes into the textile lab, it's very special.
Stephanie O'Grady is a textile conservator.
It's got such a significant history, and you do feel a level of responsibility on how you handle it, how we treat it, how we're going to display it.
The dress is on loan from Henryka's family. There's been a lot of discussion with the curatorial team about how to care for it.
Our general policy for loans is, very little intervention. Anything that we do to it, we have permission of the lender and take it from there. For this one, we made a mannequin. They wanted it vertically displayed to give a really full sense of what it is. It's a beautiful plaid gingham day dress. It's actually a very dark navy blue. It's about 1 centimetre, navy blue and white stripe, but the plaid is the extra line that you get through the white to give it that extra effect. And it's a very typical sort of day dress of that era.
The dress is both hand-sewn and machine-sewn, presumably with machines that were used in the camp to mend soldiers' uniforms.
And I suspect in the environment that it was made in, you would have had someone who was very skilled at tailoring, who did the cutting and pattern making, and then there would be a team of different, most likely women, stitching. So these very tight machine stitches that you can see, but the inside
on the bodice,
it's just a lovely sort of bloused bodice, a sort of rise and fall collar, very puffed short sleeves, fairly high bodice, which was quite typical, and a really lovely sort of flowing full skirt cut on the bias. But they've really made huge use of the fabric available. So when you look at it, it looks, perfect. When you look at the inside, you can see little pieces that have been added because they didn't quite have enough fabric, but they've joined it always along the pattern. So you don't notice any of those when you're wearing it. I'll just lift up the skirt so we can get an idea.
This is the hem?
This is the hem that we're looking at, and this is one of these little pieces that's just been added in. They've run out of fabric, and they've just inserted this little piece to support and fully finish the hemline.
Such attention to detail.
It's incredible detail, and that's happening all across it. But when you come to the seams, they're all hand stitched, hand finished. So the main seams are machine stitched, but all the hand finishing is on the raw seams to finish them and make sure they're not going to fray. And that happens all across the dress. There's some photos that I have here that give you a better idea of what's going on with the piecing. This is the inside of the waist that we're looking at in a photo, and it just shows again this horizontal strip that's been added into the back waist just to give the right length, fill out that bit of material that was lost. This is all the beautiful hand stitching and a range of people. You can see different people doing different pieces just in the way they work the seams.
Henryka had carefully stored the dress alongside her silk blouses and beautiful shoes. Stephanie says it's in remarkable condition for its age and what it's been through.
You can tell the care that Henryka gave to it her entire life. The cotton is, still very strong, relatively strong, in that sort of comparison. But for the age, the cotton is very strong and in good condition. There is some staining sort of down the front, but minimal for something that would have been worn and worn. It was her only dress when she left the camp. She would have worn it endlessly, washed it, re-worn it. So it's surprising that there is not more wear that's obvious. So there are a few stains, a few, little holes. None of those affect how we display it. They're just part of its story. There was one little section that I did some stitch repair with permission, just because we were concerned while it was on display, the weight of a vertical display pulls on seams, and so we wanted that to be strengthened a little bit across there.
The hardest part was making the mannequin that the dress is displayed on, because the dress has no side openings, just the buttons down the front.
And so to get it onto a mannequin is quite difficult. It's not like you wriggle into a dress and sort of manipulate your body. We had to get it past a very small waist and not a huge opening. So the mannequin is actually made in two pieces, the bottom part and the upper torso, and I had to cut the shoulders back considerably to get it through the opening, and then we've attached little sections, almost like little epaulets off the sides of her shoulders to support those shoulders of the dress.
None of which you would know by looking at it.
None of which you know. That's the whole idea, I hope, of a good mannequin. But it does raise a lot of issues about size. For her, when she left the camp, she would have been extremely thin. I suspect when they made this, they gave her a good amount of growing space, knowing this was one of her only possession to be worn. So she would have grown into it. When we display an item, we need to look after the dress itself. In this case, it's filled out to a larger degree than, say, she would have been when she left the camp, possibly as she grew and put on weight. She filled this out. Later photos of her are quite busty, but she was a very tall, striking woman, and she would have looked amazing in this dress.
Was there any story about the one missing button?
No, we don't know the story of the missing button, and we wouldn't ever, in this situation, replace it. That's part of the dress. It's disappeared somewhere along its lifetime, and so when it's on display now, it's just got a tiny little pin to hold it in place. But no, we don't know where that missing button is. That's another story in itself.
After the war, Henryka was reunited with her mother and sister. She worked as a nurse in England, migrated to Australia in 1953, and lived a full, happy life with her husband Rudy Shaw and their 3 daughters. In 1996, she gave her testimony to Steven Spielberg's USC Shoah Foundation and wrote a book called Standing Tall. Eleni says her dress represents the turning point in her life.
She had been dehumanised to such a great degree. She had lost everything. She was broken mentally, physically, emotionally. Her family had been taken away. And I really see this dress as symbolising that kind of transformative moment where she is going from death to back to life, back to some kind of normality, back to civilization, back to life and hope.
And this dress would have really restored her dignity.
Absolutely, just by being clothed, which is such a basic human need. I can imagine that would have been just a huge morale boost for her, knowing she had survived and knowing that the hell of the last few years was over.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. The next dress we're viewing is not on public display. Eleni and Stephanie have spread it out on a table so we can get a good look.
This dress belonged to a woman called Maud Josephine Tyrrell. She had this dress made in 1945 when she first became engaged to her fiancé, but she didn't wear it for 3 years.
Maud was born in Queensland in 1923. She had a sister and 3 brothers. One was killed in the war. Their mother had died when Maud was just 5. In 1942, the family was living on a farm near the racecourse in Townsville, where a large US Army base had been established.
Maud met a young handsome Yank by the name of Clovis Hebert, but he was known as Cliff. He knocked on the family door to buy a horse from her father. It wasn't long before they were dating, but they were never allowed to be alone. They always had to be chaperoned. It was a very short walk across the paddocks to her house from the camp. And Cliff was a US Army cook, and he would bake fresh donuts for her every Sunday and ride these donuts to her door on his horse to woo her, and it certainly worked. In 1945, they became engaged, they planned their wedding, and Cliff was very quickly shipped out to New Guinea, so the wedding was cancelled. But the dress was made, so the dress, I believe, was made by a local dressmaker. At that time, obviously Maud didn't have her mother to help her make it, but it was packed away. And then that really began the long wait for Maud.
The first US troops had arrived in Australia in late 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. By mid-1943, their number had swelled to around 150,000. There were plenty of opportunities for the US servicemen to meet the locals. It's estimated that between 12 and 15,000 Australian women married American soldiers, and at the end of the war, that presented a huge logistical challenge.
The US Army called it Operation War Bride, and over that period they transported 70,000 women and children from across the globe, starting in Britain in 1946. The press dubbed it Operation Diaper Run. Yeah.
And this was a slightly different situation, though, for Maud and Cliff, because they weren't actually married.
That's right. So unfortunately, Maud had to wait a very long time to get transportation out. Under Operation War Bride, women with children were prioritised first, and then brides. And because she was technically a fiancé, she had to wait to the very end. She caught the very last bride ship from the port of Sydney in April 1947. A ship called the Marine Phoenix. It was a converted troop ship that was just set up for transporting women and children to the US. And she had to wait 3 years before she saw Cliff again. Now, if you remember, they weren't allowed to be on their own. So when she arrived in the US, it was the very first time they had been alone or on a date together. So you kind of have to wonder if she was thinking, can I remember what he looks like? Are we still going to be in love? Because they had spent more time apart than together.
Maud and Cliff were married 6 weeks after she arrived in Laconia, New Hampshire.
I've got a clipping here from the New Hampshire newspaper at the time. It describes lovely little Maud Tyrrell brought with her from Townsville, Queensland, her white satin wedding gown, made along classical lines with a long train and her full-length veil with orange blossom headdress. Seldom has Laconia seen a sweeter bride than the motherless girl who kept house for her father, Joseph Tyrrell, back home in Townsville, nor a prouder bridegroom that Clovis Herbert, whom she met when served overseas with Battery C of the 197th Regiment. The bride has been the guest of his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Paul Herbert of 63 Summer Street, since she came here 6 weeks ago. So Maud was put up with his parents. They were French-Canadian. They didn't speak English. She didn't speak French. And I think she just really started to long for home, long for her family. They fell pregnant really quickly after they were married, but she miscarried. Her grief, she couldn't really work through her grief because she had no one around. But they did fall pregnant again, and she gave birth to a son called Michael. When Michael was 9 months old, their marriage was starting to break down, and Maud actually returned to Australia with Michael. She returned to Townsville, moved in with her father, the same house, and remained there for a few years. Her father became sick and he died quite suddenly. And Maud and Cliff had been in constant correspondence. They were writing letters, and Cliff said to her, "Why don't you give our marriage another go?" And she did. So she shipped out to France because he had been posted there with the US Army, and they continued and had a very long, happy marriage.
The reunited couple moved around the world with their 3 children. After Cliff's retirement, they settled in Australia. Maud's wedding gown travelled with her. It's part of a recently acquired collection that includes the identity disc Maud wore on the voyage to the US, her going away and honeymoon outfits, a waltzing Matilda-themed yellow jacket from her older brother, and wedding gifts, including a well-used baking dish. Stephanie is part of the team that's been assessing the dress.
It's really beautiful, and it's very typical of that 30s, 40s wedding dress style. You have a very long, elongated shape. There are a lot more figure hugging in that period, lovely flowing skirt lines. This is long-sleeved, which was the style of the day, with very high necklines, a little collar, sort of turned down collar, and the whole bodice is almost like a sculpted shirt front that then includes fuller gathering in under the arms to fill out the bust. It's got 19 fabric covered buttons down the front and another 5 on each pointed cuff. All of these ornamental. The access into the dress is actually from some press studs on the right shoulder and another tiny little hook and loop fastening under the left arm. So to get into it, it's another dress that you really sort of wriggle in. And for such a donut-filled courtship with Cliff, she was tiny.
The dress is made from an ivory satin fabric, which was popular at the time.
And it does have this quite wide or gradated stripe through the satin fabric, which gives it this really interesting sort of geometrical composition to the dress. And it was also very popular, the use of chevrons and geometrics in this period. In the back of the dress, they've inserted a panel with a point that leads your eye down the centre back of the dress. That extends to a godé-pieced skirt that gives that fullness, which ends in a small round train. Really lovely, simple but very effective use of fabric and movement through the dress.
We can really notice the age of this dress. Looking at it laid out here before us, there are a number of stains on the fabric. What's it been like to work with this dress as a textile conservator?
It's looking like it's been bundled up in storage and shipped around the world like she did. You know, she continued to obviously move this dress around with her for its entire life. So, of course, when it comes into the collection, it is incredibly creased. It's got a lot of staining, particularly on the back train. When you lay it out, you see these sort of more clearly. There's general discoloration that happens to fabric as it ages, so more yellowing, particularly around the cuffs, the armpits, you know, those parts of a dress that sit really closely to the body. The staining is significant, and in some areas, when we put it on the mannequin to take these photos recently, it's surprising how many of those can just sort of get hidden amongst a drape of fabric. But when we think of something, any possible treatments that we do to this, you need to think of it holistically in one go. There was discussion that we might be able to do some treatment early on and come back to it. With a dress like this, particularly this sort of fabric, the creasing, to reduce that and bring it back to a sense of how it was worn, really needs to involve probably a fully wet clean, but then you do a lot of stain treatment prior to that. So there's a lot of thought that goes into the types of stains you might have, testing of stains. Can you actually remove any of the stains? Often you can't, which is annoying but unfortunate, and just the way garments are.
And are you going to damage the piece more by trying to remove the stains?
Absolutely. There's a lot of damage you can do by trying to, make it look good, and that's definitely the skill of conservators, to know what they're dealing with and when to stop. That's very important.
So at this stage you're still working out what you're going to do with this dress?
Sure. We generally treat things as the curators are raising things on an exhibition list for new displays throughout the memorial. I haven't seen this one come up yet on a display list, but it may well into the future, and we'd have a good thorough look at it then.
And in the meantime it's just kept probably more carefully stored than it has been for the last decades.
Absolutely. So everything that comes into the collection gets assessed for its storage needs, and for this it's definitely a flat storage, padded out in a box, acid-free tissue, nice stable environment away from the light. So good sort of regular humidity and temperature.
And what's your emotional reaction to this dress, Stephanie?
I really like seeing wedding dresses. I find them very interesting. It seems that brides tend to go one way or the other. They either want to get rid of it, it was hideous, and then it doesn't fit them anymore. But other ones like this just have a really strong connection to their owner. The woman who wore it was married in it. Here she was, a new bride in America. It's amazing. It's really lovely to see. I find clothing very personal. You wear it, so it's got a lot of history and meaning associated with it.
Eleni agrees. She says Maud's dress, like Henryka's, represents a transformational moment in her life.
I think it really just captures that longing and that period where Maud just had to wait. She had, there was nothing within her power to arrange transportation out to the US. She was really at the whim of authorities and what was available. She had packed it away, but was waiting and hoping and longing for that special day when she would finally, marry Cliff.
And you have a photo here of Maud wearing the dress in her 80s?
Oh, yes, that is so sweet. Her daughter sent me that. She still fits in her wedding dress I think she must have been in her 80s there. Just incredible that she still fits into this tiny dress, because as you can see, it is incredibly petite. Her daughters describe her as being very short, petite, and just a really lovely person.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.